All right. Thank you all for coming. I want to just briefly say a few things. First, I want to thank Angela, David, and Bridget for joining this panel. They were my first and only choices to be on this, and so I'm very grateful you guys came. The objective here is each person, the structure is that each person is going to speak for 11 minutes on a talk, strict cutoff, and then we have 10 or 11 minutes of discussion afterwards on each talk. It's the first half of that second discussion is the panelists are going to ask questions, feedback, riff, brainstorm on it, and then we open it up for questions, and then we move on to the next one. And the sort of, as Angela described in the big session, the objective is to share a bunch of different approaches that behavioral scientists have taken to improving student achievement and everything. And this is all some of my favorite work. And so Bridget Terry Long is a professor here at the Harvard Ed School, the academic dean, and I'm a longtime admirer of her work. So thank you for joining, Bridget.
Great. Do I have to use this? I do. All right. So good afternoon. It's wonderful to see all of you, and thank you, Todd, for organizing this and for bringing together friends to talk about a bunch of interesting work. I somehow lost the drawing of straws to go first because I'm providing a little bit of kind of framing and overview before we hear more about the other work. But to start, so I'm an economist by training, and I've been focused on issues of human capital, really looking at the transition from high school into college. And so I've done a bunch of work on financial aid, on college remediation, academic preparation, but I kept running into these puzzles that really motivated getting more into behavioral sciences, behavioral economics. Questions like, why do students fail to apply for financial aid they're eligible to receive? So if you just fill out, take 30 minutes, if you have no assets, very low income, take 30 minutes to fill out the FAFSA, you can get a $5,000 Pell Grant. And we're seeing again and again in the data that students didn't know that the application existed, but then even some were making it to college and leaving money on the table just because they weren't filling out this form. Really big puzzle, especially if you're coming at this from an economist where you think, oh, you want to maximize your individual benefits and so forth. Other questions about remediation. So I did a lot of work on remedial and developmental courses where we find 40% of students are not ready for college level work. You look at their transcripts in high school, they should be fine. It's not quite understanding how they're randomly taking a set of courses and then ending up in college paying, college tuition prices for high school level material they should have gotten. Examples of people taking out $30,000 debt for a 6-week truck driving program, certificate program. So lots of these puzzles in education where people are not making optimal decisions. And so while we know affordability is very important, academic preparation is very important, but common for both of those things are really complex processes, and people have to sort through lots of complicated information. And quite frankly, in some ways, students have too little information. People got the word on that, so then they started throwing tons of information at students and parents, so then they had too much information, bad information, late information, lots of unclear processes, cumbersome applications. And so this is an area, if you just kind of look at the education pipeline, where you see it riddled with issues of how do I sort through these complex processes. But in many respects, I started thinking about information as having costs as well. So economists are very good at thinking about things like price and even the cost of time and so forth. But information is costly to collect, costly to sort, and costly to process. And particularly when you're talking about low-income students, first-generation college students, knowing how to navigate a system that is in no way built in any kind of logical format explains a lot of why we don't have people who are very qualified being in college. And of course, the consequences of making poor decisions is really huge. And so this is where I focus some of my work. Going to behavioral economics, perhaps too much choice is bad, particularly with non-experts, as we've seen, the early work being much more for white-collar professionals and 401ks. When you have so much that's high stakes, complicated information, people tend to procrastinate. And then you put that within the realm of education, and you can see these problems are even more severe, where you have very unsophisticated consumers trying to sort through this information. So some of the options that people have been pushing are simplify the options, the choice architecture, provide assistance. And so I'll give 2 examples from my work where we tested some of these things. The first one being an H&R Block FAFSA study, which is the financial aid form. The second one being a very, very recent, just finished analyzing some of the results last week, a college savings initiative. So the first one, this is work done with Eric Bettinger at Stanford, Phil Oriopoulos at the University of Toronto, and Lisa Sambumatsu from the NBER. Our goal was to test if you gave help with the federal financial aid form, what would happen in terms of student outcomes. And we were able to take advantage of the fact that H&R Block and Brookings were working together to do these different projects. They were willing to build something on their platform where if someone came in to do their taxes, they would do their taxes as normal. And then we built the software that would randomize the group. And for the treatment group, we took the tax data they had already submitted, pre-populated the financial aid form. We put on another protocol to answer the rest of the questions on the FAFSA so we could finish it completely. On average, families from the are you interested in learning more about higher education to filling out a background survey to filling out the IRB form and then actually finishing the form, it took 8 minutes. We were able just to streamline everything. And at that time, we would give them an individualized estimate of their financial aid eligibility, and we had a deal with the Department of Education where we could submit their FAFSAs directly. The quick outcomes from this were that they were really huge. It had a huge impact on college enrollment and persistence. 7 percentage points, so again, 8 minutes of time spent with a family increased college enrollment 7 percentage points just by getting over this one particular hurdle. 3 years later, they were just as likely or more likely to still be enrolled, so it wasn't a matter of just getting people into college who probably shouldn't have been there. They were actually persisting. It seemed like it sped up enrollment for some who would have delayed because it was matching them with financial aid. Their financial aid receipt was much higher. And so for a long time, people were saying, well, if people aren't filling out these financial aid forms, maybe they shouldn't be in college, but it actually looks like the skills you need to complete the FAFSA are orthogonal to the skills you need to actually persist in college. There's something different about the way that this whole thing is set up. And so moving on, a more recent project, so we said, okay, we've just noted how this, something that looks like such a small barrier, if you can get over it, has these huge long-term effects, even though we never did anything else in terms of those participants. So we said, what's another process or leak in the pipeline where there's a lot of puzzles in education, and one is college savings. So you see a lot more discussion that no matter how much financial aid we have, no matter if every eligible student actually filled out their FAFSA, there's still going to be a lot of unmet need in terms of costs. And so families, if they can, are going to have to save in order to be able to contribute, or else it leads to a lot of debt. And so you see a number of states, of cities, San Francisco, Boston, New York is considering this, where they give college savings accounts to, you know, when students are first born, or kindergartners, or different parts along the pipeline. And then the 529s is a federal plan where you can put money into the account and it grows tax-free. But there are lots of questions of why families don't save more. There are a lot of different hypotheses. It could be low awareness. There's a lot of misperceptions about tuition costs, about what happens if you save and does it influence your financial aid eligibility. But if you have ever looked at the 529 application, it's in about 5-point font. It's 6 pages long. It has all kinds of scary language. You talk to parents, you know, who say, yes, I want to save for my child, but they procrastinate and put it off. I'm, you know, culprit number one with this, especially when you're confronting a very daunting application. And so with money from the Gates Foundation and the Department of Education, we set up another randomized trial focusing on the parents of 7th to 10th graders in the Boston Public Schools. So we did this over a course of a couple of years, and we're able to get a sample of about 1,000 kids. The control group just had a general information session saying, now that you're entering college, now that you're entering high school, here are the things you should do academically to prepare, as well as you should think about saving and the fact that there is this FAFSA that you're going to have to do eventually. Just information. Treatment group 1 had that information, plus we talked more about the 529 application, what the benefits were, and we had kind of step-by-step how you fill out the application. You can skip page 3 and 4. They're actually optional. Someone will sit down and help you fill out this form. So if you knew you wanted to save, but the form was really daunting, we were giving you some personalized assistance to use the form. But then we also suspected, maybe assistance wasn't going to be enough. So a second treatment group also got $50 to open the account. So the minimum opening balance for a Massachusetts college savings account is $50. The Gates Foundation kicked in that money. So if you wanted to open an account, we would help you, and we'd put the initial $50 deposit in the account for you, and then we would wait and see what you chose to do. So we've been tracking the account since. It's now 2 to 3 years since that initial workshop. And what you can see, the control group, basically nothing happened. Information alone was not enough. Assistance alone was not enough. But for treatment group 2, where we gave the deposit, about 25% of them decided to go ahead and open an account. And the interesting thing with that is, afterwards, we didn't talk to them. We did nothing. We've been tracking their accounts, but Fidelity sends them a quarterly statement saying you have money in the bank for your child. 1/3 of them opened up or set up automatic monthly contributions. It could be from $15 a month to $200 a month, all by themselves without us doing anything. And the second treatment group saved nearly $300 more than families in the other groups. Again, we just spent 45 minutes with them, and then tracking them over time, it kind of puts them on a different trajectory. So I'm going to end with some larger questions and issues that I think maybe we'll come back to as a panel. Been thinking a lot about these issues, have other ongoing work that I haven't mentioned, but I think a key question is we've identified that students have too little information, but we haven't quite figured out how do we deliver that information to actually change and move their behavior. So when you really sit down and think about the specifics, as we've been designing in my project groups, as we've been designing this information, what's the mode of delivery? Do you give it to them versus snail mail or text? So Ben Castleman and Lindsay Page were students of mine, and they did a bit texting things. They've done a number of projects where that's been very beneficial, but sometimes it doesn't work. Can you send them paper? Do you send them to the web? Do you have to have a person? Who should give out that information? Should it be a trusted mentor, a school official, a peer? Lots of questions with that. And some of my projects we found, actually, you don't want the school to be the one giving the information. You want the YMCA or the Boys and Girls Club or something like that. What information to provide, how should it be presented, how often should you give this information? And a key question, which I think will come up because Todd and I have talked about this, is how do you continue to capture the attention of the people you're trying to reach? As texting goes by the wayside, as every technology every few years gets replaced by something else, and the space is so crowded in terms of communication, when we're trying to influence behavior, how do we keep people's attention? 2 last questions. Looking at all this work, I'm writing a paper about the power of nudges in education, but in another respect, the power of people, that sometimes nudges are not going to be enough, perhaps when the task is really complicated or the information costs are really high. And then finally, I think what we're all searching for, rather than a bunch of kind of one-offs, a project that worked here, a project that worked there, are there universal truths? Can we replicate our results in other contexts with other populations? How much does context matter, and how can we really tease out the mechanisms that are at work so that we can not only figure out, okay, it works in this one instance, but predict that it's going to work elsewhere? All right.
Great. Thank you. So I think, no, I think we,
For the
yes.
recording,
Yeah.
that's the only reason why I did it.
So I figured since we have this esteemed panel, if you guys have thoughts or responses quickly, I have a bunch, but I will let you. What? No, please, you. As you're presenting, both of your studies that you presented, the FAFSA and the college savings account, have these long-term effects from a brief, short intervention initially. And I know that I've observed working with O-Power, these kind of persistence effects, and David has written about it a bunch, and Angela observes it with the sort of the longevity of grit, and she's going to talk about an intervention that has some time duration. I wonder whether you, when you're developing these, or whether you would think there are ways to proactively build persistence into it. So like how to proactively harness it. So I was thinking about your story of whoever runs the 529 plan, that they keep hitting your people up to save more money. I would think of that as like a rip current, like you're pushing people into someone else's activities. And I think that's cool, but like to build the intervention proactively, to intentionally build in other kinds of things. And I don't know if there's.
So for the question about the 529 project, we originally had that in the application, but it turns out it's really hard to get a sample of 1,000 Boston Public School parents to come anywhere. So we ended up really devoting our time to getting sample and not doing the follow-up. But you could imagine, those fidelity program statements that you get every quarter could have just-in-time information or could push for one thing or another thing. We did follow up with a survey to ask, as a parent, are you talking to your child about the fact that you're saving for them? And so we got some interesting responses with that. And the part of the follow-up we're doing right now is trying to get the Boston Public School transcript data to look in the group that was in the second treatment group, what happened to their students in terms of academic preparation, because some of this is not about low-income families putting away $15 a month. It's really about the feedback mechanism into academic preparation and other kinds of things. Now, some of this you might be able to skip over completely. I mean, when we got out of the FAFSA work, we said, why don't we just fix the form instead of having to devote all these resources? And so our paper, actually, the first draft of the paper came out in spring 2009 when a friend of mine was on the Council of Economic Advisors. We had a new president, and all of a sudden a bunch of things changed with the FAFSA, although they didn't take it far enough. But this is one of those cases where if it has no relationship to actual college success, let's change the process altogether rather than having to come in and teach people a worthless skill.
So I love the FAFSA study, and I teach it whenever I can. So one thing a question I always get is thinking about what it means to be a person who may be questioning whether they belong in college, and then you encounter this labyrinth of choices and the feeling like there's a barrier between you and college. That is, like there's not only the treatment doesn't only provide people information and help them complete a process. It also says that you're the kind of person, perhaps, or this is the kind of society where you can find assistance or where people do want you to succeed. And I feel the same way, I guess, about the savings, as you were saying. Perhaps parents come to see their children as differently, as investments, in specifically investments in their intellectual development. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
So I think with FAFSA, with a lot of processes, applications, and so forth, and so I'm going to talk to a bunch of scholarship providers in a couple of weeks and really remind them that the application process is a huge barrier. And so what we realized in talking to a number of the participants is they don't realize filling out the FAFSA is not a commitment. It's an information gathering exercise and helps you see what's possible in the world. And people didn't really kind of understand that. But when you see, we were very careful if you're working in Cleveland and in the city that the pamphlet looks like people who look like you and look like in your neighborhood, along with the messaging. So I think that changes things. There's also a lot of talk in being here at Harvard. The New York Times spends too much time on the tuition price of Harvard. We actually distilled for them, look, if you go to Cuyahoga Community College, this is actually what the tuition is. It's not $55,000, it's $1,500. And oh, by the way, you're gonna get a Pell Grant that's gonna cover the whole price. So we do the net price calculation for you. Some of it is also that. And this is the issue with, there's too much information, there's too little information. And if you can use processes that already exist to personalize the information, then maybe you have a chance.
Just to follow up, I guess I think that one reason for the duration could also be that people are coming to see themselves or their belonging in a different way. So very explicitly, inspired by your work, we took first year college students at UT and had them complete a financial aid form that in one condition it was easy to complete. In the other condition, after you got to the bottom and clicked submit, it told you needed a 24-character password and it deleted everything on the page. And then
you got that through IRB?
Yeah, serious debriefing. Well, what was amazing is no one suspected that it was fake because they expect things like that from UT. And what we find is that everyone finds it frustrating. It was a 2 standard deviation difference for frustration, but only first-gen students said, this means I don't belong at UT. continuing gen kids said, you should fire your web designer. And there's something that comes from advantage where you perceive bureaucratic hassles as an affront, and you're entitled to not experience them. And if you question your belonging, so I guess I wonder if your interventions in some way might have a side effect of allowing people to see themselves as a kind of person who could thrive and succeed in the society setting.
So hold on. What is the time?
30 seconds. 5 minutes.
Got it. Okay. Good.
Okay.
Good. Okay.
I would love to say that that's the case. I'd love to build that into some future things. And a very different project in Chelsea, Mass, just north here of Boston, where you have these parents doing saving circles and so forth. We were testing to see, how more information affected how they treated their students and if their students went to school. But what we didn't realize was going to be an outshoot from this is the circles actually created parent social networks where they were reinforcing each other, and it wasn't just, I'm the only one who doesn't understand this. And then they were working together kind of as groups to figure out how to navigate a really complicated system. So rather than you feeling like I'm the stupid one versus, no, the system really is just really messed up and we need to figure out how to navigate it. That was a great offshoot of that project.
If you keep the mic, I just want to, do you have a couple of sentences on the power of people? I mean, I know that's a whole paper, but
That is a whole thing. So part of that is coming from other work that Eric Bettinger, one of my constant collaborators, has done with Inside Track, where a coach called a student while they're a college student and kind of talked to them about what's going on. Have you planned for when you're going to study? Have you planned where you're going to go study? These kinds of little things. But it took a person, that personal contact, to actually be able to move the dial. And so we started wondering, some things are complicated or are so personalized that you couldn't write computer scripts, to figure out every kind of eventuality. You needed a person who was going to gauge. It didn't necessarily need to be a lot of time, but there seemed to be some problems where you can just streamline, and because everybody's going through the same pain, but other things that are so personalized, and even the H&R Block study, what we realized with a lot of those tax professionals is these were people that families had been going to year after year after year to get their taxes done. So there was a trust element. It made something about the delivery of who was giving them their information versus if it had been just some random tax professional. We don't know, but we have lots of different theories about what is the role of people in this versus what can you just do by anonymous text or anonymous website or anonymous paper.
So I think we have a couple minutes for questions. Is that what you were saying with the 5 minutes?
No, 5 minutes after she talks.
Let somebody go.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll take one question.
I'm done.
Oh, so this is my fault. Poor planning, and poor communication. Are we officially out of the 10 minutes that we had originally thought was allotted for discussion?
Yes.
Okay, got it. That's my fault, everybody. Sorry.
5 minutes. 5 minutes. I'll put it back.
No, we have 5 more minutes.
We have 5 more minutes. Good.
Now we have like 4. But
Yes. So is it 5 or 4, Angela? No, I just okay. We can take a question. I think I'm supposed to run this to somebody so it ends.
have to do that. I'll use the overheads.
Okay, good. I have one thought on that, which is I was thinking that one reason people might be powerful is that they're motivational. And I was wondering if even if you knew the question, whether an algorithm could be useful. And it would be cool to test whether an algorithm expressing disappointment in you could be motivating, right? Like you could have algorithmic being like, Bridget, I'm disappointed in you, and it's just a machine. But yes. Please.
Hi. I'm from the Canada Revenue Agency, and we do a lot of experiments with people where we send them very complicated information. So the question of how you send the information, in particular who sends that information, is quite important because we don't see any improvement. The more information we send, people just seem to be more and more confused. So we did an ethnographic research where we went and actually stayed with people for about a week in their businesses the first time they did a tax return, and we realized that they really don't want to have any information from us. We are the last people from whom they want information. They want it from their community, they want it from their friends, they want it from their neighbors, they want it from people like them. So we are changing very much the outreach to actually use, as you said, those communities to try to get that information, but the right information, because often it wasn't. But we found it was the most striking finding of that research, was that they really don't want us. So it may apply to you as well.
Right. I mean, try running a college savings project in like 2010 with the name Fidelity on any of your forms. That's the worst possible thing you could do when you're in the middle of a recession for a low-income family. But yeah, you have to find who they trust or want to hear information from. And the summer melt work, there was also an avenue where they did peer mentors, where they matched the students with someone who was a couple of years older in college from their neighborhood to try to see, what role that would play.
Okay. All right. I think that. Thank you, Bridget. Okay. So I have 10 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes of discussion. Students spend 80% of their waking hours outside of school, and the vast majority, if not all, basically 98% or more of money is spent on educational money is spent on improving the experience in school or what's learned in school. So my lab, we focus on, rather than focusing on the student, we focus on the people who care about the student and trying to figure out ways to mobilize and empower them to support students outside of school. The work falls into 3 buckets. The first is connecting families with what's going on in the classroom. So like the average American family hears from their school outside of report cards in public schools about 2 times a year. And so they basically don't hear anything. And what we do in this body of work is just sort of connect families with the administrative data that we already have, grade books, attendance data, whatever, push out to parents and try and empower them and inform them of what's going on in school. And we find that that can be particularly potent in improving student achievement, and also, importantly, when parents get useful information, they use it, they improve student achievement, and they want more of it. It actually increases parent demand for more information. They don't know what they don't know, and when you empower them with actionable information, they act on it and improve student achievement. The second bucket is trying to connect more people who care about the student with the student's education. And so a version of this is in college, and this is sort of people power, I guess. When students, it came from, I was doing a focus group at a community college, and I asked, who cares whether you finish school? And this one guy says, my supervisor at Home Depot. Another person says, my partner. Another person says, my grandmother. They all have somebody who cares, but it's not always the same person. And those people are all completely cut out of what's going on in school. So what we do is when a student enrolls, they name a friend or family member with whom they communicate regularly. So I might name Bridget. We work together. And so each week you'll get updated on what's going on in the class. This week Todd learned about Oedipus. Ask him why Oedipus poked his own eyes out. This week Todd has a midterm. Ask him what his study plan is. This week Todd has to make re-enrollment decisions. Ask him what his plan for next semester is. And the idea is, how do we turn the social network into a support system? We also do that for the K-12 space. We call it My Students Team, where we get parents or guardians to name another adult who cares about their child. It's usually a grandparent, a coach, or a mentor. And then we send report cards, and this is through the mail. We'll send report cards, we'll send course schedules, we'll send attendance reports. And the idea is trying to connect them with trying to do 2 things. One is invite these people to play a more active role in the student's education. The second is give them something actionable to talk to them about. That's in pilot stage now. If you talk with everybody who does education research, these things, years of piloting before you can sort of get it right. And I think David's gonna nail on that. The third bucket is targeting false beliefs. And this is what I'm gonna talk about a little more concretely. This is going to focus on beliefs about attendance. So it turns out attendance is important for a bunch of reasons. One, it correlates and predicts all sorts of bad things, from drug use and dropout and standardized test scores. Basically, students can't benefit from being in school if they're not in school. The second is it's expensive to reduce absenteeism. It costs about $100 to $150 per incremental day of attendance. By having mentors and social workers, the best evaluations we have is that they cost, for each additional day they generate, cost about $100. In a bunch of states, each additional absence leads to reduced revenue for the district. So we work in LA Unified and Chicago and Houston. Each of these districts get revenue per kid per day, somewhere between $20 and $40 per kid per day. And so for each additional absence, they lose revenue, or for each additional day of matriculation, they gain revenue. And then finally, the federal government has made this coordinated effort as part of My Brother's Keeper that the Department of Ed is coordinating to reduce absenteeism among the most at-risk students. So this is to say absenteeism is important. We're going to focus on two false beliefs that parents have about absenteeism. The first, parents underestimate their own kids' absences by half, consistently. So if my kid has missed 20 days, I believe my kid has missed 9, 10, 11 days. The second is we're only going to run an experiment. The experiment we're going to report on is in the bottom half of students. But you ask parents of the bottom half of students in their school and grade. So stratifying by school and grade, you take the rank order lowest half of attenders. The majority of them think their kids' attendance is average or better compared to their classmates. Right? So they don't realize that 100% of them are actually worse than their classmates. But they're really miscalibrated on these two beliefs. So inspired by this O-Power-like intervention, we're thinking, why don't we do something like O-Power? And so we randomly assign 28,000 households in the Philadelphia school district to one of 4 treatments. One is a control group that gets nothing all year long. The second is a reminder group, which just gets 5 rounds of this reminder. And I think this is the light there. So you see the weird bar that's going to turn into a graph in the next condition. But we appreciate your help. This is just 5 rounds of a mailer like this. Another one just adds the total number of absences your student has missed. So between these two conditions, we're going to tease apart what's the marginal effect of including information just about total absences. And then the third condition, third treatment arm, adds to this, adds a social comparison compared to your classmates. Right? And this looks exactly like O-Power. And we actually pilot tested whether the bars should be horizontal or vertical. And yeah, the 150%, if anybody is trying to figure that out, which just ignore it, it's 50%. I constructed this for the slide and I messed it up. And I also misspelled Archon, I think. So I would black the whole thing out. How do I, this? No, okay. So we pilot tested it and the horizontal bars are much clearer to families that are low numeracy, which was surprising to us. My collaborator on this is a statistician, Avi Feller. He thought negative bars would be most effective because missing school is a negative thing. People had no idea what a negative bar means. But so it turns out this is actually what O-Power does, if anybody has seen O-Power. So we end up looking at the effect on absences over the course of the school year. 5 rounds of the reminder mail. On average, these households receive 4 mailings for complexities involved in the implementation. And the reminder alone reduces absences about 0.6 days, about half a day. Adding total absences, so comparing this condition to this condition, just adding this information, we do surveys at the end of the school year, and we see that we actually made these parents much more accurate on total absences, so we know we corrected the belief as a manipulation check. And then adding that information doubles the effect, so about 1.1 days of reduced absence. And then now we want to see what's the effect of adding the social comparison information, right? And so we're going to compare these two conditions. Adding the social comparison information, for those of us in the sort of behavioral science world, would think that it should reduce absence more, but it doesn't. It has no marginal effect. And we know in surveys that we corrected this belief. Parents became much more accurate on this belief. This is not anywhere close to a ceiling effect, so we've seen bigger effects with other interventions. To put this in context, this increases attendance about 1.1 days per student. So that means that sending 4 of these mailers increases attendance by 1 day. So to just, right, 4 mailers increases attendance by 1 day. Some false beliefs, some biased beliefs matter. So the first biased belief that seems to matter is total absences. It's hard to keep track. And parents, when they lose track, when they are miscalibrated on it, for some reason, making parents realize that their kids missed 20 days instead of 10 makes them get their kid more likely to get to school the next day, which is not obvious if anyone thinks about it, that the 21st day should be worse than the 11th day, right? And so it appears that parents have a belief in increasing marginal cost of additional absences in their sort of, like their belief about the student's production function. other candidates, one candidate belief that we're working on now is you get these students who, and we've replicated this result in another large district that'll be public later this week, one of the other 10 largest districts in the US. One of the other candidate beliefs is that parents of students who we think have a 40% chance of graduating high school, like 9th grade kids who have missed 40 days and so on, almost 100% of their parents think that they're still on track to graduate, when we would predict they're going to drop out in the next year and a half. That's another candidate belief that we're going after in subsequent research. This reduces absenteeism by 1.1 days. What's interesting, it fully spills over to cohabitants, so to the students who live in the household with the student. So we householded and then randomly chose one. We get to look at the treatment effect on the cohabitant. And the effect size is roughly as big, which says we're doing something to the parents. Either that we're changing parents with regards to all their kids, or the kids are influencing each other, which we can't tease apart. Costs about $5 per incremental day of attendance. So in this district, we generated 15,000 to 20,000 net days of school, compared to $100 to $150 per incremental day of the current best practice, which is social workers and mentors specifically devoted to attendance. Social workers hired to reduce absenteeism. It reduced chronic absenteeism by 10%, which is the federal goal. So it turns out the effect appears to be largest on reducing absences around this threshold of missing 8 to 12% of school days. It's scalable because it uses administrative data and it's automated. It doesn't require humans. It just requires syncing up and then communicating to parents information that they find useful and is not something they already know. And we've actually started an organization, it's basically like O-Power for attendance, where we're helping districts around the country scale up this intervention. We tried to help a half dozen other districts do it themselves, and no district is expert in dynamic data and personalized mail. And so all 4 of the districts that we worked with gave up after the first try because this isn't their job. And so we started the organization to help districts implement it themselves. And that is it. I'm out of time. Good, great, thank you.
So maybe I'll use my question as a question of clarification. Todd, the null finding where the social comparison information, which I'm sure a priori you thought was going to have a big effect, like, oh my God, my kid is whatever, 50, whatever it is. Like, I guess the question for clarification is it that half of the kids would be above average and half of them would be below, or did you only provide that for the high absentee students?
We only selected students in the bottom third.
The whole treatment universe.
Yeah, the whole treatment universe is wrong. So yeah, you could check our pre-registered analysis plan. We had a very strong prediction about social comparison.
Yeah.
That is not
Was there
right.
any moderation by the sort of like, okay, well, was there any treatment effect for those who were like vastly different from the average? There was no treatment.
There was no heterogeneity by grade level, so it's K-12. So it's not just the parents don't know their kid is cutting, it's the grades K through 6 have roughly comparable effect sizes. It's not moderated by gender, total absences the previous year, race, free and reduced lunch status. No covariate that we have seems to moderate, and we're really well powered. I think, I know that I've screwed up the order a couple times. Well, David or Bridget, and then we'll go to.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like Hunt's work on willingness to pay and O-Power.
Mm-hmm.
So, is there like a hidden negative cost to parents of the judgment or social pressure or stigma, and what are the data saying about that?
Yeah, we asked in all of the conditions in this survey at the end, would you like us to continue to deliver a service like this? And the treatment group was no different than the control group, which meant that at the very least, the forecast of the experience was no different than the experience of receiving it. I mean, this is something that we're looking at. I mean, we anticipate that there will be increased parents like attendance at parent-teacher conferences or things like that, but we don't have that data. But we've wondered about that too.
So 2 quick things. One, as I think about reducing absenteeism, and the fact that you had up to 5 different messages, I'm wondering, an absence in the middle of February when your kid has the flu, might be totally valid, but other times of the year you might see that parents are just saying, "Oh, sure, go ahead," and this kind of intervention would prevent that. And so I'm wondering, over the course of time, if you saw certain postcards at certain times of the year had more of an impact versus not. And then the second part is actually not a question, but something I think might be helpful for the audience is Todd and I had this discussion, and remember I posed the question of how do you communicate, what mode of delivery do you use? And we had this debate about, my work was about getting you over one hurdle and getting to the other side, where this is something that's much more of a longer, you've got 180 days, and who knows if it's day 3 or day 175 that your kid is going to want to be absent, and why you chose these postcards rather than something else.
On the second question, so we hear from parents, both in the focus groups and in surveys, that they put the postcards on the refrigerator and they show them to other adults in the household. They take on a social life, and they show them to the kid. And so the reason we did postcards instead of something like texting, which we do a bunch of too, is because we don't know which day a student is going to be absent. And we want the modality of communication to match the kind of behavior we're trying to change. We have a project now where we're trying to, we can actually predict when a kid is going to be absent. And we're actually doing preemptive interventions where we're planning to hire social workers to reach out to these families that we think the kid's going to be absent tomorrow based on this big data approach. And that, a different modality would make sense. But here, we try to make them social objects, and so we started adding comics to them, inspired by Jim Griner's work. And they're always in the language spoken at home. This is a Spanish one. Your first question was?
Timing of the year and looking at specific mailings of postcards and if there was an effect.
So there are at least 24 and probably infinite reasons that a student misses school, from kid protesting with the parents to instability in the home, like the family is evicted, another is the parent is working night shift, the other is a sibling is sick, and the other siblings stay home. There's like all of them. It doesn't appear, we're trying to push the margin on all of them when we don't have any evidence that any one margin is particularly being moved. But we've thought about it. It's hard to tease apart which margin is most likely to be moved. Okay. Yes?
It's really interesting that the use of social norms didn't seem to affect the outcome very much at all. Did you have any theories as to why that is? Because I'm from Australia and we seem to be pushing that out a lot at the moment on the back of all of our electricity bills. It has how much you consume as a two-person household in comparison to the average two-person household. So it's really interesting that it didn't actually seem to make a difference in this one.
Yeah, talking about energy use, to put it in context, O-Power reduces energy use 2 to 3%. And so just like when we start talking about scaling things, like we need to realize that at scale things have modest effects in general, but they can be extremely cost effective. The question about why not social norms, one idea is that maybe the gap between your comparison student and yourself was too great. So in ours, we actually, the average gap was 5 to 1, massive. And so I have a paper where we find that people get discouraged by massive gaps in online universities. And so it's possible that, and that's sort of something we're exploring now in another site. There's lots of other possible reasons, but that's the one that I think is most promising. Or maybe there's something about this being particularly ego protective and the social comparison doesn't work in this domain.
Well, so in the energy case, I haven't yet spent the energy I'm going to use next month, because it's next month. But in this case, I can't take points off the board.
Yeah.
Those absences are already on my record.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could rephrase it in a way of like what you're projected. So if you have like a dashed line of projected for next month, if you keep it up. Yeah. Versus projected in the next month for the average student, then there's something I can do about it.
Yeah, I totally like that. It's hard to tell for districts it's hard for districts to accept that you're projecting their kid is going to miss a bunch of school next month. No, but that's exactly. So the closest we're coming to is maybe we'll make sure the gap is surmountable. It's like 1 day instead of 7 days. But I think that's exactly I think a really useful way of thinking about it. Yes.
So what I'm puzzled is about the fact that you range from K to 12, in the sense that, and you're still both targeting parents, in the sense that with kindergarten, like let's say until elementary school, where I would assume that the parents are much more aware of the number of days that the kids are missing just because you need to take them to school. As far as they go, I mean, I'm just.
They're no more accurate. They're no more accurate in the control group in estimating how many absences their kid had.
And even if when you do like just play primary, but this is, this was something which would be very interesting to, explore how it can be, because in a way, in higher grades, you would think that they are just skipping school without the parents knowing. But in elementary school, and then the power that the parent has in enforcing the kids' attendance is very different, would seem, in primary school versus in high school. So the fact that there is no difference here, it's by itself, I think, incredibly.
Yeah, and the same pattern holds in the other when we've replicated it. I think you're right. The mechanism must be different at different age levels, but we're not able to tease it apart right now. But I buy that. We're gonna move on to the third one, which is, thank you guys.
Okay, so you're supposed to stand here, hold this, and it's like an executive function.
And then this doesn't really, yeah.
No, all right, cool.
Hi, I'm Angela Duckworth. I'm actually presenting the work of my postdoc, Lauren Esquis-Winkler, to whom all credit is due. The credit that's not due to her is due to the social psychologist who helped us with this intervention, David, and his friends. I think of you guys as the Stanford crew, but you're at Austin, but anyway. So I guess the question that we had when we started this intervention was, could you teach kids something that was true, that was a scientific insight about practice in particular, that would then change their own behavior and performance. And this is, as I mentioned during the trailers, during the preview, I think what comes after nudge, right? Like after you make things the default and you change the surroundings, there is the idea that, and maybe it's complementary, that you also equip people with the insights that led you to the nudges in the first place. So the metacognitive insight that we wanted to share with students was really the work of Anders Ericsson. He's the cognitive psychologist who studies experts. My joke about him is that he is the world expert on world experts, because that's what he does. He studies Olympic athletes and Nobel laureates and expert radiologists, prima ballerinas. And this graph summarizes what he's found, which is that world-class experts keep climbing up this learning curve, whereas many of us plateau in our learning. This would be what I call the plateau of arrested development. You stop getting better after a period of time. And of course, it's possible to drop out altogether. Now, what keeps you off the plateau of arrested development is something that Anders calls deliberate practice. And it has a few key features that we guessed some students might know and that many students might not know. And certainly that many students, as a former classroom teacher, many students didn't do, whether they knew to do it or not. The first is that when you're doing deliberate practice, you have to do something you can't yet do. Sounds pretty simple, but I finally got to go to yoga yesterday after a long hiatus. And the teacher said, well, just close your eyes during tree pose. And of course you might fall over, but that's great because it's yoga and you're going to learn something about balance. Nobody closed their eyes because nobody wants to follow. It doesn't feel all that fun to do something that you're incompetent in. You have to try 100%, you have to focus as close to 100% as you can. You need feedback. Human beings, like rats and pigeons, don't learn in the absence of feedback. And then finally, probably the hardest part, and maybe why nobody closed their eyes during tree pose and yoga, is that you have to actually pay attention or reflect on that negative feedback. And I personally find that that's the hardest thing to do of all. Now, when you talk to experts about what it feels like to do the kind of practice that reliably and most efficiently makes them better at what they do, they give descriptions like this from Martha Graham about how it is fatiguing, how it can be frustrating, how the disappointments can feel like daily small deaths. She's an artist, so she exaggerates a little bit. But I will tell you, from my own interviews of world-class performers, this idea that the kind of practice that reliably and most efficiently makes you better is not at all like flow and is often devoid of the kind of pride and joy that is the fruit of practicing and skill acquisition, but not the process of it. We thought that the phenomenology, the feeling of practice, might be actually a false clue for some students, that they might think that frustration and fatigue and disappointment might
might suggest to them that they're on the wrong track, not the right one. So I just want to walk you through a few screens of this intervention. This is a two-class period intervention. In our lab, we use the 15-minute rule, which is take the number of class period minutes, like if it's a 45-minute class, subtract 15. That's how much you could potentially have with students after they go to the bathroom, get lost, can't get logged into the computer, et cetera. And I just want to give you a sense of what this this is a two-period intervention, the first period looked like. So there's a welcome screen. We paid a graphics designer to make it look good. We told the students that we were scientists at the University of Pennsylvania. We're experts on this research, but as students, you're the experts on what other kids will find interesting. Just the director's cut, my commentary on this is that we tried to both signal authority, but also respect for the students. We let them know that really this intervention was not for them, but it was for other students, and we just needed their help in making the intervention better, because we didn't want them to feel like they were the beneficiaries of our, wisdom, because we didn't want them to have the reactance that many adolescents would, just like, oh, this is to help me, I'm going to immediately stop listening. But we wanted them to help us help others. We changed the term deliberate practice. In our piloting, kids were like, deliberate what? What's deliberate? Like deep practice versus shallow practice. So we changed the terminology. We added cartoons. We told them about practicing in other ways. We said, as a student, you have to practice what you do. We added cute pictures. We made everything we hoped like ethnicity and race neutral and balanced for gender and cartoons that had people in them. We told them what deep practice was. We gave them graphics. We tried to keep it simple, even though deliberate practice or deep practice has really 4 things, because there's an aspect of repetition. We sort of saved that lesson for the second module because we thought 3. I learned this from being a McKinsey consultant. 3 is a great number for trying to tell anybody anything. And so then we walked through, it's like, this is what deep practice is. And then we illustrated each of the principles with a testimonial read in the first person by a kid. So I had to get like my friends' kids of roughly the same age to read this. But I think it's ideal, as David will probably tell you, to match on dialect. And if you can, to match on gender, or to at least have some sensitivity to whether kids will respond more to a same-gendered person. But anyway, these are things like, I just started taking Spanish for the first time, blah, blah, and this is what happened to me. Now I'm learning how to study better. And these testimonials are actually not only serving the purpose of reinforcing the message from a storytelling kind of point of view. Kids in this intervention are themselves going to write testimonials, so we were modeling for them what we want them to do at the end of the intervention. We added some activities that were more interactive. I was like watching my own 13 and 14-year-old, then a little younger, like do these ridiculously stupid things on BuzzFeed and on Instagram, and I was like, I can't get the kids in my interventions to do. Why are you wasting you're not supposed to be on your cell phone anyway, but since you are, like, why are you doing these things? Because they have these like little quizzes and these sort of like, what Downton Abbey character are you most like? They don't even watch Downton Abbey, and they're like, I'm like Mary. So we decided that we would just try to make it a little more interactive and a little more like the kinds of things that kids do. So there'd be like very short questions and things that are phrased. One thing that I noted when Carol Dweck edits interventions, I mean, she just makes the writing good. What I mean? It's like, oh, it's just better written. So we tried to do our best in that vein. In this screen, do you have an example of a stretch goal related to school in your life, something at school that you want to accomplish that you haven't yet? Don't worry about spelling. Just write one sentence telling us your stretch goal in the box below. Again, like so that they weren't just clicking through screens in a passive way, but doing things that are more like the kinds of things they spend time voluntarily on. So we walked through the 3 principles, focus 100%. We had them, for example, in this question, do you think texting, Facebook, and other people are distracting? From the list below, tell us what students a year younger than you are most distracted by. Check as many boxes as you want. Because again, the frame of this is that we're developing this for kids who are a little younger than you, and you're the expert on kids who are a year younger than you. Help us do this. And by the way, it also provided information to us as researchers about what is actually distracting to kids. It is texting. Period. This is something that maybe I could say that Lauren would take a little more credit for, because it was not quite borrowed or stolen from other social psychological interventions. It occurred to us that really to learn something, you need to experience it. So in this part where we're trying to explain to kids that focusing with all of your attention or most of it is better than like simultaneously texting, monitoring Instagram, watching television, and listening to music, which is how my children choose to study. We wanted to show them. So in this part of the intervention, they actually did math problems, and then they did them again while listening to Kevin Hart tell a joke that was PG rated. And without counterbalancing, because we didn't think that they would think this hard, we showed them their actual math results. We're like, oh, look, this is how you did, and showed them that when they're distracted by another stimulus, they actually do fewer math problems. So I'll skip ahead just to the very end in the interest of time to say that at the very end of the intervention, we had a little video, we made a video. All these things, as David and Todd and Bridget know, take roughly forever, right? Like years of like, then we made a video, that took a year. But I will say towards the end that there was something very important, which is that after modeling these testimonials from other students, we asked students themselves to actually write their own post about deep practice and to communicate in their own words something that they think would be helpful to someone who's 1 year younger than them. And if I have the social psychologist right, it's Aronson the elder, right, who originally, the saying is believing effect can be accredited originally to the social psychologist who said, if I stand up here and I tell you that deep practice is really great, then I myself, Angela Duckworth, will be more likely to do deep practice when I have the opportunity. Saying is believing. And then finally, let me just end with the results of the study, which are that in a random assignment group, and I have the placebo control slides, which by the way took equal amounts of effort, time, graphics design, et cetera, to create, compared to that placebo control, the treatment group did more deliberate practice on a task that we also invented and validated for the purpose of this intervention, including up to 4 weeks at follow-up. But I will also tell you that if you follow these kids over months, the effects go away. So there's nothing magic in the sense that we didn't fix kids for life. But I think what it reveals is that, for example, when you look at underachievers, this graph is a kind of a moderation graph to show that the intervention helped kids who were below the median in their achievement on grade point average according to school records. It didn't help or harm the high achievers. To me, this says that there is what Ron Ferguson would call psychological slack, that these kids can do what they are not showing in their grades, and it's up to us to do more than this. But I'll leave with this slide to transition to questions. I do believe that these metacognitive interventions are important for kids. I think that we should figure out how to, create these in a way that are not 2 class periods with the hope that we've changed kids for life. Teach teachers about deliberate practice, teach parents about deliberate practice. Of course, recognize that there could be downsides to this. I don't see many, but I'd love to hear questions. And then finally, what are the mechanisms of such interventions? Thank you for your attention.
So thank you, Angela. This is really fascinating. So question, I don't know if it's a question or just kind of an extension, because I'm thinking about the role of the teachers, and also compare to what Todd and I both presented. This is more about habit building, repeatedly doing an action, and so you have the students kind of change what they did for a little while, and then it disappears. And I wonder if the teachers, and this might even get to some of the mindset stuff, said, hey, we're going to practice all these problems that I know is difficult. That doesn't mean that you're not capable. That doesn't mean if you're struggling that that's bad. That's actually exactly what we want to do. Kind of reframing that the struggle isn't meant to be discouraging, but it's meant to be, that's what school is about. Because I know even with my second grader, I'm always saying, ask the teacher questions. That's why the teacher is there. And they see it as a sense of weakness.
Yeah, no, I think that is exactly the direction to go in. I just have 2 quick thoughts on that. One is we have folks from the World Bank here, and I think really these random assignment studies at the student level are often just for power, right? Like you wouldn't do that except for you need an N of 500, and God knows, an N of 500 study when it's schools or even classrooms just gets very, very expensive. That's why God invented the World Bank. So we are doing an assignment that it is teacher and so that they can do that, right? And we tried. I mean, who knows? We'll see. Fail better, right? Like we don't know whether the teacher intervention actually helped do exactly that. And the second is I'll just say that, data that David, you collected in a national study, and I'm thinking about Kyla Hamovitz, the graduate student who's just leaving Carol Dweck's lab to come and be my postdoc next year. I think what she's seeing is that it's exactly what you intuited, which is that the teacher's verbal and nonverbal communication about what it really means to make a mistake is the driver, it seems, of more than like explicit growth mindset. It's sort of like, that kind of like crestfallen, oh my God, I can't believe you did it, sort of thing, versus like, awesome, like, like what can we learn from it, right? So, yeah, I affirm that. Yeah.
Well, just to build on that, I think deliberate practice could easily, in the hands of a novice, come across as like telling kids that exercise makes you skinnier, or that just other things that feel awful that are good for you in the long run. And that's like what 14-year-olds are worst at. And so, so I think it'll take some creativity to come up with the version of this message that like mere mortals can pull off in like the diversity of classrooms and with all the other competing demands that teachers have. Because I think the risk is that it sounds like, oh, this awful thing that I'm giving you that's like, it feels like a million deaths, you're welcome. Right?
Yeah, no, I think that there could be a real, Lauren, the student who led this, her latest idea is like, well, maybe we should teach kids that, frustration and effort are a signal of, like, just a good signal versus a negative signal. And she was thinking about this very old work by Robert Eisenberger, where he trained rats to actually like effort because he paired effort with reward. He called it learned industriousness. Then he published a Psych Review article in 1992, and then there was like not much done on learned industriousness in that period. But he did it using, behaviorism, like pairing of rewards. And she thought of using a sort of just like tell them that, right? Just use it, like give them the appraisal. But I think the backfiring of that is like, it's not that frustration is always good. Frustration is a sign that your goal is being blocked, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're dumb, and it means that like errors and frustration and failure can be part of learning. But you don't want to you have to do this the right way. Otherwise, you license teachers to give kids like impossible work, or you teach kids like not to ask for help. I mean, you can see this not going well.
Yeah, but I think there's so much potential. But the moderator could be orthogonal as trust and respect. Like Mr. Miyagi could get Danielson to like wax on wax off, right? But they like trusted. He's like, I'm here to help you become a ninja. And then under those circumstances, he was willing to like do deliberate practice, right? And so so the idea that like relationships paired with an exhortation to deliberate practice might be the 2x2.
And as we know, challenge and support are the two dimensions of parenting that go together, right, when you have the best outcomes. So, yeah. Am I supposed to direct now? Is that what I'm supposed to? Okay, hi. Yeah.
Hi. So to Jared's point, I think we were just kind of whispering, there's a value at the end of that. He's going to, kick some butt at the end of the thing, right? And here we're just saying, right? And here we're just saying, you'll be a better person for it, right? Or you'll have a skill. It's the correlate I was thinking about was the marshmallow longitudinal, where now we've seen that the marshmallow kids that could wait it out, have more in their bank account. I swear to you, that has just revolutionized my second grader. I mean, he's like, wait, if I actually don't eat that thing, I might have more money. He doesn't really grasp what that means yet, but he definitely sees that there is an outcome that may come from some self-control issues that he hasn't been able to deal with yet. And I can see him, like that has nudged him to change. So is there something that we could do in this context that really says, okay, if you can display these kinds of practices, there is a follow-on kiss the girl at the end?
Well, I mean, I will say this just briefly. The second part of this intervention was to, I think there's a misunderstanding about what success looks like. Like, I wrote this book, and it was the hardest thing I ever did. I cried, like, every day. I worked 80 to 100 hours a week, right? And it came out, and then, like, there were a few months that passed by, and then I had to read it, right? I had to read the audiobook. And because I had labored on it and sanded and buffed, like, when I read it, it felt very fluent. The whole thing took, like, 8 hours to read. read. And I was just thinking, like, if somebody listened to an 8-hour audiobook that reasonably fluent because of all that sanding and buffing, they would think that the process was also fluent. But it's really disfluency and error making and mistake making and falling down that like leads to it. So the second part of this intervention was really just to like show them that. So we had videos of people like Will Smith and other people like an MIT graduate who had, figured this out on his own, and like, first person testimonials. Because I think there is that asymmetry of information that like before you actually realize that that's the path, you have no idea that that's the path. Am I allowed to take another question? Okay, one more question.
Is this me?
Yes.
Oh, all right. Hi.
Hi.
You were talking about distractions and deep versus shallow learning, and I was just wondering if there might be an advantage to mixing deep and shallow learning within the same session, maybe in terms of creativity or problem solving. I'm just drawing anecdotal evidence from my own working style, but I was wondering if there was any evidence for that.
I don't know of evidence for that, but I also think that this deliberate practice in literature has a boundary constraint, which is it's often studied in things like chess or like where it's like a skill or like track or something where it's not necessarily the most, chess players can disagree with me, but it's a relative, it's not like where divergent thinking is super, but I will say this, when you just look at a teenager who's quite literally watching their Instagram account, their Snapchat, and how they have 4 different text group messages, and they're also studying for their history test, generally I think the outcomes are not great. Thank you so much.
All right. There you go.
Okay, I'm starting my timer. Okay, hi everyone. Is this working? My name is David Yeager, and I'm going to talk about some issues of scaling these types of interventions. But to start kind of with the psychology, so life transitions are hard. So here's a graph of student self-esteem during college. What you see is that people start pretty confident from the beginning. Then they confront that freshman calculus or writing seminar. They wonder, maybe I'm not so great. Maybe I'm not so smart after all. This same type of graph appears in other life transitions, the transition from 5th to 6th grade, transition from 8th to 9th grade, transition to first-time parenthood. We have a 4-month-old baby at home. We do lots of things that make us wonder, what do we do? What's going on here? From work to retirement, et cetera. But in general, people who stay in an institution tend to show improvement over time, at least on average. But people in this kind of trough of confidence may not be fully aware. They may not know that later things tend to improve under some circumstances. So in such moments in a life transition, it's common to ask, is this normal? Will it ever get better? And so how people answer these questions, their attributions, can really matter for how they cope. So people who say school is difficult in this moment because of something bad and permanent about themselves, for instance, maybe they're not smart enough, they don't belong, show less resilience and ultimately achieve less. But people can be given a different lay theory. And they can be given a theory that difficulties are common, that they have the potential to improve, that they're not fixed, they're not permanent. And so a number of studies in social psychology have taken an approach that's tried to give people a different theory so they can interpret this data, this early difficulty that they're going through in a life transition. A number of people have done these studies. A lot of these have been done with small samples and increasingly in larger samples. I'll talk about 2 such studies in my remarks today. One is the idea of a growth mindset, Carol Dweck's idea. A growth mindset of intelligence intervention disabuses students of the notion that difficulty means you're dumb. And it does so by conveying a compelling and memorable metaphor, the idea that the brain is like a muscle and it strengthens during times of difficulty. A different intervention, more recent intervention, is what we call a purpose for learning. This gives adolescents the lay theory that learning from difficulty and challenge are the means for addressing unfairness and injustice in society or for helping one's family and one's community. And so in different random assignment experiments randomized at the student level via the internet, different researchers have found, well, our research group and other people who've replicated this work have found that even brief exposures to either of these messages can reduce course failure rates among high schoolers. So in one study by Ponescu, about 1,500 high school students completed one or the other or both of those interventions, and then their grades were obtained from the school registrar. And what we found in this paper was that among students who began high school at risk for dropout, there was a reduction in DF averages across all core classes from 49% to 40%. In a pre-registered replication that we just published this year, we looked at 10 schools. 95% of students within schools completed the interventions, and there we also see a reduction from 39% having DF averages among previous low achievers to 32%. So overall main effect as well. But a huge question we get when we present results like this is that these interventions should be scaled indiscriminately. They're low cost. They seem to be effective. They seem to address some of our most important problems. And so we're increasingly spending a lot of time saying, what are some of the issues with scaling too soon? And what are the things you want to do before you can feel confident? That is, when you're moving from null hypothesis rejection research, which is what we've been doing, to policy changes potentially or changes in practice at scale, it's essential to know not only that something can work under some specified set of conditions, but also for whom and under what conditions. And so there are kind of two issues that come up. Now, if you return to this idea of a lay theory intervention, if we teach you something over the internet, at least two things have to happen before your grades could go up. So first, the treatment needs to change your mind. And second, your changed mind has to translate somehow into the outcome. And that should only happen when the necessitating conditions are in place. So if you don't encounter situations where your changed mind helps you learn more, then the treatment shouldn't increase your grades. So if you think this way, there are at least two orthogonal concerns for scale. So one is calibrating manipulations so that they're persuasive. And the second is some issues around the composition of the sample used in evaluations. And I'm going to illustrate this in the context of something we call the National Mindset Study. And the goal here is to prepare growth mindset and sense of purpose interventions for implementation in 9th grade classrooms across the nation. And this comes in direct response to questions about whether you could take those initial studies I said and hand them out to the country. We said we need to do some things, we need to learn some things before we feel like that's responsible. So the first idea was calibrating materials. And so materials used in those initial demonstration studies were not calibrated for any other population besides the ones in which they were tested. And sometimes they weren't even tightly calibrated for those. There's a legacy of manipulations used in the lab, and then we put them on the web. There's not currently a method for taking early, promising treatments and then making them ready for an entire population. So we've tried to address that. We've tried to create that method. Here's kind of the broad strokes. One is to narrowly define a user group. So to have a psychological theory about a problem facing a defined group of people, a group of people where they matter, where there's some impact for an eventual long-term policy outcome, but who may share psychology and therefore may be affected similarly by the same psychological materials. We focus on the transition to high school, which really helped us constrain the arguments we needed to make, as well as our user testing pool. Then what we did, informed by the Stanford Design School, was to carry out user-centered design, kind of rapidly putting mediocre versions of treatments in front of teenagers, and really expecting and relying on 14-year-olds' abilities to tell us things that they hate. And they did so very readily across a number of versions of our treatments. And then we made tons of changes in response to those. We don't really overdo it. We don't always ask them what the treatment should look like, but we listen a lot whenever they tell us what feels inauthentic, what feels phony, what feels too controlling. We also had some intuitions that we tested with a series of randomized experiments, multifactorial designs with thousands of participants. We conducted, I think, 17 or 18 different conditions over a two-month period. These were often mundane, like which metaphor to use or whether to tell people the intervention is good for them. The answer was no. And this occurred over a period of about 2 years, in addition to a bunch of rewriting. So this is a 2-year period between those initial promising results and then the version we were ready to scale in the nation. Here's the super lame first generation. Like I said, we didn't even try to make it cool. This is the third generation. Like Angela, we paid some designers to help us out. We made the arguments very much more clear. And the way we tested this was not to wait on a year-long RCT, but to pick a proxy behavior that was likely to show effects in the immediate term. And what we did was created what we call the make a worksheet task. So imagine we had students at the end of a long survey, at the end of the long intervention content, have the option to make their own math worksheet. And they could either fill it up with problems that would be easy, that they would definitely get right, but they won't learn anything. And they were explicitly told they won't learn anything. Or hard problems where they could possibly get a lower grade, but they would learn a lot. What we found is that in the first generation treatment, students chose more easy than hard problems. This was reduced in the second generation treatment, but by the time we got to the national study, then easy and hard problems were equally represented in, among students' choices. The second issue is sample composition. The samples used in all past evaluations of behavioral science experiments, even when having large N's, can't produce generalizable results because they weren't randomly sampled from a population of interest. But however, even standard probability samples won't allow you to learn enough about heterogeneity if those moderators you're looking at are confounded. And that's the case when you look at school achievement level with racial composition in the United States. You might have a theory that high minority schools would benefit most from the treatment because the treatment might reduce effects of stereotypes, yet you might also think that in the worst schools, the treatment shouldn't work. And so there's competing predictions about racial composition and school achievement, and these two are confounded. In our nation, sadly, the correlation of percent minority students and school achievement level, for instance, PSAT score is 0.6. So what we did was construct a sample that intentionally oversampled off-diagonal cases so that we could try to separate out inferences about racial composition versus school achievement level. And then we administered the treatment in 83 schools in the fall with an average 94% response rate. And just these are hot off the presses results. We just got the data from the research firm last week. And what you find is that across the country, there's an overall positive effect of 0.23 standard deviations. But crucially, there's no correlation between the size of the effect and the achievement quality of the school, which means that we have a treatment that's changed the immediate psychology, it's changed mindsets, it's changed initial behavior. And so what we'll look at is what are the necessitating conditions in the school that are required for a change in mindset to turn into a change in grades. We also find that in all but 6 schools, there's a positive treatment effect. So the main takeaways here are that these lay intervention effects are real. They can be useful for education, at least in the settings where we've tested them. But we don't think the materials we have, even in large sample experiments, are always ready for broader implementation. We think there's a process that needs to happen to calibrate the materials. But all real effects vary. And I'd like to talk a lot more, if you'd like, about how to construct samples thoughtfully so that you're prepared to learn about the heterogeneity in your effects. Thanks a lot, and now I take questions.
Yeah.
So wait, just so I know, because like that's what it is. So the treatment effect is 0.23 standard deviations
On the make a worksheet.
on the make a worksheet task, treatment versus control.
And
It
what
is
what is that? The on the make a worksheet is choosing the hard task.
choosing hard.
So there's
hard.
so they tell us what math class they're in, and we've curated a menu of Khan Academy problems that are from the math class that they're in, and then they see 4 different pages where they can choose problems labeled as hard, you'll learn something, easy, you won't learn anything, or medium, you learn a medium amount. And so they believe they're going to have to complete those problems at the end of the survey.
Can I ask another clarifying?
Yeah.
So that DV happens right after the...
Right after session 2.
Got it.
Exactly.
Thank you.
So those are the
Thank you.
immediate
That's
effects.
interesting.
Yeah.
That's cool.
The
But-
pilot we have GPA for the national study, the school year's not over yet.
Right. Okay. so I'll just be very brief. So what were your a priori, your a priori predictions about moderation?
The hope is that the treatment changes mindset and immediate behaviors equally across all subgroups, and we don't find any moderation here. However, subgroups who, now that they have a new mindset, are better able to cope with the demands of the school, they should benefit differentially. But if a school is such a disaster that there's no learning happening, yeah. So the idea is that stereotyped students or previously low-achieving students in schools where there's at least the modicum of opportunities to learn should benefit. In the top schools, maybe they've already optimized the mindset environment. In the worst schools, they don't need a mindset, they need like safety.
Right.
That's the prediction. So we'll look at that. But it would have been a problem if we didn't change the mindset or the immediate consequence of the mindset to the same extent across our different levels of moderators. That's a boring explanation of moderation, is that the treatment was inappropriate for certain people. The treatment isn't inappropriate for any groups of people so far, we can see. So now we have a test of the theory. We wouldn't be able to get to that heterogeneity test if not for the calibrating.
So will you be able to look at individual students beyond the school level, but just thinking?
So we get student level records on grades, discipline, and absences for all the schools.
And so are you going to be able to investigate within a school who really seems to be driving the results, or is it everybody?
Yes.
Equal? Okay.
Yeah, so student level covariates and stuff.
How'd you get the 3,000 students to when you were iterating?
A lot of those were Qualtrics panel and MTurk.
Of students?
Yeah, so Qualtrics panel is really interesting. Adults who are in the Qualtrics panel can consent their teenagers to be in experiments.
You just have to pay for it.
Yeah, it's just expensive, but yeah, you can do experiments with teenagers with parents who provide active consent if the adults are in a panel. So the idea is minimum viable products that were kind of crappy, but they varied in the version that mattered. So like one of the most informative things we learned is it's really common for people to say, growth mindset, really good. Here's a fixed mindset, really bad. Now, after I've told you that, you should choose the growth mindset. That version of the treatment caused people who started with a fixed mindset to be more entrenched in it and to increase in their fixed mindset. And yet, people kind of use Carol's book as a treatment in classrooms a lot, but it's a terrible student level treatment, at least as far as we can tell, or at least in our tests so far. It's perhaps better to say, look, here's a fact about the brain. It's true. Yeah.
Did you consider changing the customization for some dimension of school cultureness? Like you chose a population of 9th graders, but there's probably predictable heterogeneity in some like key cultural attribute,
right.
Like what kind of things they think are cool or something.
Right.
And did you actually think about because that's a different version of where I thought you were going to go when you were talking about custom.
Yeah, well, I mean,
customization.
Well, one thing we learned is that our guesses about what different groups would think was cool were wrong all the time, and they picked out the different meaning from things than what we had intended. So one example is the scientific examples you use to support the neuroplasticity argument. So a famous one is rats. If you take rats in unstimulating environments, their brains grow less than rats in very stimulating environments. Kids looked at that and said, A, we're not rats. B, screw you for calling me a rat. And so, we weren't predicting that. So instead what we did was try to split the difference, but also capitalize on ambiguity, where we created opportunities for people to imagine themselves or people like them as the speakers in certain things. So, really ambiguous names and descriptive norms. We had, kind of diverse groups of people. So Carol and I had written some text that had made its way into Michelle Obama back to school speech. So we had actual audio from a Michelle Obama speech that perfectly said what the treatment was, which is great. So we use that in the treatment.
Quick question, because you
Yeah.
started this as framing as how do you go at scale? And so you're really focusing on these 14-year-olds, but it's a school level intervention. So
during implementation, what did you do with the principal, the teachers? How did you get them all on board?
We didn't do
Does that-
anything because we didn't want to break the blinding, and so what we framed it as is a freshman orientation survey. This
It's
is
random assignment at the student level.
yeah, it's random assignment at
Okay,
the student level.
within school, okay.
Yeah, we didn't want contamination.
Yeah, so this is a big question with scale. You find something, you're gonna have the teachers on board, the principal on board, or if you wanna have longer term results. And so
Yeah,
it's
it's-
easier
it's-
to just skip them and find opportunities just to skip those elements, but
Yeah,
changing practice is hard.
I mean, most schools have some kind of freshman orientation. And so at the college level, what we do is one administrator can make a unilateral decision to say this is the form everyone has to complete. And like at UT, that's what it is. The provost says this is freshman orientation. Everyone has to go to the mindset treatment. And so then it took 2 people to do that experiment. Districts can also make unilateral decisions about, but I think the gatekeepers for scale of a student delivered treatment, I think, is something we want to learn a lot more about. But at some point, it could become standard practice, potentially.
Just how to get from point A to point B.
Yeah. Okay. So questions to the group. Yeah.
This issue, the reactivity of 14-year-olds, just came up now and came up earlier also. I'm reminded of a paper by Chris Bryan in Chicago, which I think he's called Stick It to the Man, in which he teaches adolescents about the food industry, taking from sugar, salt, fat to fat, I think, and says, look, they're trying to get you. They're trying to, and he finds that less and then leads kids to choose healthier foods. So is that something what do you think of that?
I think that
In the
paper's
context
brilliant.
of the distraction.
So Chris and I wrote that.
Oh,
and
what do you
so-
know?
Yeah, we've been working on that for 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
It's nice to be excited.
Yeah. Well, so the basic finding is that, and the theory underlying this is that there's all this research on adolescence as onset of puberty causes this dramatic rise in testosterone. And we know testosterone does a lot, but one of the things it really does is focus attention on status, in particular threats to status. And often people think of that as just making you attuned to what peers are doing, but it really makes people also concerned about injustices from authorities. And so being told to do something that is tedious and unpleasant now for the long-term benefit that I as an adult have decided for you kind of works against that developmental stage. And the idea is, can you turn that reactance and harness it and turn it into something that's in the favor of, in support of positive behavior. So we call that the purpose for healthy eating intervention, and it comes apart from work we've done on first having, this is in our purpose intervention, first having teenagers say, what makes you so upset about society? And next say, if you really know something, how could you do something about that? So typically learning is framed as, like in the healthy eating case, delay of gratification now so you have a good job later. But instead, and this is Chris's insight, is to say, right now you get to feel like a good person that matters because the tedious things you're doing now are a part of making a difference and being consequential to the world around you. And so the idea is to reframe learning now as an act of meaning and as mattering. And so we're really excited with the healthy eater approach for that.
So could you use that with like Facebook trying to distract you, or all these people trying to? Could you use that?
Yeah, well, so I mean, we're borrowing in part from the Truth Campaign, which is a very effective anti-smoking effort, where instead of saying cigarettes are bad for you, you're going to die of cancer later, the Truth Campaign said tobacco companies are spending lots of money to trick you and to take away your autonomy, and here are images of tons of teens flooding the streets, yelling in megaphones at the rich fat cat executives who are trying to control your choices. And so we take that same logic to the healthy eating case. And the Truth Campaign led to dramatic reductions in smoking.
I
Maybe
think.
one other question? Yeah.
Okay, this is the last question.
Yeah, sorry, 'cause you said that you did not involve teachers because you were afraid of contamination. But what about the reverse? That basically by not involving teachers, you're creating cognitive dissonance in the students, where you're telling them about growth mindset, while the teacher is telling them the reverse, and or the parents have a very fixed view about failures and or behaviors. So then that can actually counter after whatever you're telling.
Yeah, I guess I'd say that's a hypothesis. And it's a hypothesis that no one has been able to test because no one has measured teachers' mindsets and then looked at whether it like interacts with student level treatment effects. People have measured teachers' mindsets. They haven't done a randomized student treatment and interacted it with classroom variance in teacher mindsets until the national study. So we surveyed all the math teachers in this study. We got 93% response rate, and we have teachers' mindsets. We have did an IQ test. They did an implicit racial bias test, and we have lots of other things. So we'll be able to look at the cross-level interaction, and it could be the case that the most fixed mindset classrooms show the most benefit because that's where you need the mindset. So you could imagine the opposite prediction.
Okay,
Time up.
That's it. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Bridget.
In college. There's something different about the way that this whole thing is set up. And so moving on, a more recent project, so we said, okay, we've just noted how something that looks like such a small barrier, if you can get over it, has these huge long-term effects, even though we never did anything else in terms of those participants. So we said, what's another process or leak in the pipeline where there's a lot of puzzles in education, and one is college savings. So you see a lot more discussion that no matter how much financial aid we have, no matter if every eligible student actually filled out their FAFSA, there's still going to be a lot of unmet need in terms of costs. And so families, if they can, are going to have to save in order to be able to contribute, or else it leads to a lot of debt. And so you see a number of states, of cities, San Francisco, Boston, New York is considering this, where they give college savings accounts to, when students are first born, or kindergartners, or different parts along the pipeline. And then the 529s is a federal plan where you can put money into the account and it grows tax-free. But there are lots of questions of why families don't save more. There are a lot of different hypotheses. It could be low awareness. There's a lot of misperceptions about tuition costs, about what happens if you save and does it influence your financial aid eligibility. But if you have ever looked at the 529 application, it's in about 5-point font. It's 6 pages long. It has all kinds of scary language. You talk to parents, who say, yes, I want to save for my child, but they procrastinate and put it off. I'm, culprit number one with this, especially when you're confronting a very daunting application. And so with money from the Gates Foundation and the Department of Education, we set up another randomized trial focusing on the parents of 7th to 10th graders in the Boston Public Schools. So we did this over a course of a couple of years, and we're able to get a sample of about 1,000 kids. The control group just had a general information session saying, now that you're entering now that you're entering high school, here are the things you should do academically to prepare, as well as you should think about saving and the fact that there is this FAFSA that you're going to have to do eventually. Just information. Treatment group 1 had that information, plus we talked more about the 529 application, what the benefits were, and we had kind of step-by-step how you fill out the application. You can skip page 3 and 4. They're actually optional. Someone will sit down and help you fill out this form. So if you knew you wanted to save, but the form was really daunting, we were giving you some personalized assistance to use the form. But then we also suspected, maybe assistance wasn't going to be enough. So a second treatment group also got $50 to open the account. So the minimum opening balance for a Massachusetts college savings account is $50. The Gates Foundation kicked in that money. So if you wanted to open an account, we would help you, and we'd put the initial $50 deposit in the account for you, and then we would wait and see what you chose to do. So we've been tracking the account since. It's now 2 to 3 years since that initial workshop. And what you can see, the control group, basically nothing happened. Information alone was not enough. Assistance alone was not enough. But for treatment group 2, where we gave the deposit, about 25% of them decided to go ahead and open an account. And the interesting thing with that is, afterwards, we didn't talk to them. We did nothing. We've been tracking their accounts, but Fidelity sends them a quarterly statement saying you have money in the bank for your child. 1/3 of them opened up or set up automatic monthly contributions. It could be from $15 a month to $200 a month, all by themselves without us doing anything. And the second treatment group saved nearly $300 more than families in the other groups. Again, we just spent 45 minutes with them, and then tracking them over time, it kind of puts them on a different trajectory. So I'm going to end with some larger questions and issues that I think maybe we'll come back to as a panel. So been thinking a lot about these issues, have other ongoing work that I haven't mentioned, but I think a key question is we've identified that students have too little information, but we haven't quite figured out how do we deliver that information to actually change and move their behavior. So when you really sit down and think about the specifics as we've been designing in my project groups, as we've been designing this information, what's the mode of delivery? Do you give it to them versus snail mail or text? So Ben Castleman and Lindsay Page were students of mine, and they did a bit of texting things. They've done a number of projects where that's been very beneficial, but sometimes it doesn't work. Can you send them paper? Do you send them to the web? Do you have to have a person? Who should give out that information? Should it be a trusted mentor, a school official, a peer? Lots of questions with that. And some of my projects we found, actually, you don't want the school to be the one giving the information. You want the YMCA.
All right, thank you all for coming. I want to just briefly say a few things. First, I want to thank Angela, David, and Bridget for joining this panel. They were my first and only choices to be on this, and so I'm very grateful you guys came. The objective here is each person, the structure is that each person is going to speak for 11 minutes on a talk, strict cutoff, and then we have 10 or 11 minutes of discussion afterwards on each talk. It's the first half of that second discussion is the panelists are going to ask questions, feedback, riff, brainstorm on it, and then we open it up for questions, and then we move on to the next one. And the sort of, as Angela described in the big session, the objective is to share a bunch of different approaches that behavioral scientists have taken to improving student achievement and everything. And this is all some of my favorite work. And so Bridget Terry Long is a professor here at the Harvard Ed School, the academic dean, and I'm a longtime admirer of her work. So thank you for joining, Bridget.
Great. Do I have to use this? I do. All right. So good afternoon. It's wonderful to see all of you, and thank you, Todd, for organizing this and for bringing together friends to talk about a bunch of interesting work. I somehow lost the drawing of straws to go first because I'm providing a little bit of kind of framing and overview before we hear more about the other work. But to start, so I'm an economist by training, and I've been focused on issues of human capital, really looking at the transition from high school into college. And so I've done a bunch of work on financial aid, on college remediation, academic preparation, but I kept running into these puzzles that really motivated getting more into behavioral sciences, behavioral economics. Questions like, why do students fail to apply for financial aid they're eligible to receive? So if you just fill out, take 30 minutes, if you have no assets, very low income, take 30 minutes to fill out the FAFSA, you can get a $5,000 Pell Grant. And we're seeing again and again in the data that students didn't know that the application existed, but then even some were making it to college and leaving money on the table just because they weren't filling out this form. Really big puzzle, especially if you're coming at this from an economist where you think, oh, you want to maximize your individual benefits and so forth. Other questions about remediation. So I did a lot of work on remedial and developmental courses where we find 40% of students are not ready for college level work. You look at their transcripts in high school, they should be fine. It's not quite understanding how they're randomly taking a set of courses and then ending up in college paying, college tuition prices for high school level material they should have gotten. Examples of people taking out $30,000 debt for a 6-week truck driving program, certificate program. So lots of these puzzles in education where people are not making optimal decisions. And so while we know affordability is very important, academic preparation is very important, but common for both of those things are really complex processes, and people have to sort through lots of complicated information. And quite frankly, in some ways, students have too little information. People got the word on that, so then they started throwing tons of information at students and parents, so then they had too much information, bad information, late information, lots of unclear processes, cumbersome applications. And so this is an area, if you just kind of look at the education pipeline, where you see it riddled with issues of how do I sort through these complex processes. But in many respects, I started thinking about information as having costs as well. So economists are very good at thinking about things like price and even the cost of time and so forth. But information is costly to collect, costly to sort, and costly to process. And particularly when you're talking about low-income students, first-generation college students, knowing how to navigate a system that is in no way built in any kind of logical format explains a lot of why we don't have people who are very qualified being in college. And of course, the consequences of making poor decisions is really huge. And so this is where I focus some of my work. Going to behavioral economics, perhaps too much choice is bad, particularly with non-experts, as we've seen, the early work being much more for white-collar professionals and 401ks. When you have so much that's high stakes, complicated information, people tend to procrastinate. And then you put that within the realm of education, and you can see these problems are even more severe, where you have very unsophisticated consumers trying to sort through this information. So some of the options that people have been pushing are simplify the options, the choice architecture, provide assistance. And so I'll give 2 examples from my work where we tested some of these things. The first one being an H&R Block FAFSA study, which is the financial aid form. The second one being a very, very recent, just finished analyzing some of the results last week, a college savings initiative. So the first one, this is work done with Eric Bettinger at Stanford, Phil Oriopoulos at the University of Toronto, and Lisa Sambumatsu from the NBER. Our goal was to test if you gave help with the federal financial aid form, what would happen in terms of student outcomes. And we were able to take advantage of the fact that H&R Block and Brookings were working together to do these different projects. They were willing to build something on their platform where if someone came in to do their taxes, they would do their taxes as normal. And then we built the software that would randomize the group. And for the treatment group, we took the tax data they had already submitted, pre-populated the financial aid form. We put on another protocol to answer the rest of the questions on the FAFSA so we could finish it completely. On average, families from the are you interested in learning more about higher education, to filling out a background survey, to filling out the IRB form, and then actually finishing the form, it took 8 minutes. We were able just to streamline everything. And at that time, we would give them an individualized estimate of their financial aid eligibility, and we had a deal with the Department of Education where we could submit their FAFSAs directly. The quick outcomes from this were that they were really huge. It had a huge impact on college enrollment and persistence. 7 percentage points, so again, 8 minutes of time spent with a family increased college enrollment 7 percentage points just by getting over this one particular hurdle. 3 years later, they were just as likely or more likely to still be enrolled, so it wasn't a matter of just getting people into college who probably shouldn't have been there. They were actually persisting. It seemed like it sped up enrollment for some who would have delayed because it was matching them with financial aid. Their financial aid receipt was much higher. And so for a long time, people were saying, well, if people aren't filling out these financial aid forms, maybe they shouldn't be in college, but it actually looks like the skills you need to complete the FAFSA are orthogonal to the skills you need to actually persist